We're going to continue our Civil War studies by taking a look at how America expanded westward, and that resulted in ultimately the Civil War because of a fight over what are we going to do with that land. Is that new land in the West going to be free states or slave states? So let's take a look at how our hunger for more land really developed. So going back to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, in that a lot of these areas in the South, a bit in the North, mostly we're talking about the South here, these were tribal lands. And a lot of it's the 5 big tribes in the South: Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, Seminole. And for the most part, a lot of these tribes started to assimilate, meaning that they started to farm like the rest of white Americans in the area. And in many cases, they were even converting to Christianity and kind of assimilating into the culture of the time. And whites didn't care. They didn't care if they were acting the same way. They didn't care if they already developed the land. They saw them as different, and that means they got to go. And so they wanted to displace. They say that they wanted these tribes to assimilate, but no, not really. They just wanted to take that land. And so whites continued to fight and invade that sovereign territory. And so finally President Jackson says, all right, we only got one solution. Assimilation isn't working. In many cases they are assimilated, but whites are still taking that land. And the federal government had to constantly bring in their armies to tell the white people, back off, this is native land. And so eventually the government and Jackson says, we just need to move them. We're going to take their land and move them somewhere else. And again, it's just kind of avoiding the problem. And so they just move them, kick them out of their land, and move them to kind of this new territory of Oklahoma, or the Indian Territory. So in 1830, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act, which funds treaties that force natives west. And so they're, in many cases, forced to walk all the way west. This is known as the Trail of Tears. And so that's part of Jackson. And so let's continue this kind of expansion of land. Mexico has their War of Independence, 1810 to 1821. They kick Spain out. Mexico is now independent. And Mexico starts to encourage trade between the United States and northern provinces. And a lot of this, when I say northern provinces, it's areas like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, were all owned by Mexico. However, not very many Mexicans were living there. And so they wanted to encourage settlement, but it was a bit dangerous. There were a lot of native tribes that already lived there and didn't want anybody moving in on their territory. And so they were kind of a threat to these new Mexican settlements. And so to protect the territory, Mexico encourages outside people to come in and settle Texas. So they encourage U.S. farmers to come in and settle the area. All they have to do is fight the local Native American tribes. They also had to convert to Catholicism and obey the local laws, which included no slavery. But it didn't work out. Eventually, cultural differences started to arise between these U.S. settlers and Mexico, in that the Americans were moving in, and they really refused to adapt to Mexican culture. They were speaking English only, not Spanish. Plus, they were breaking the laws by bringing in slaves and starting plantations in Texas, whereas Mexico already abolished slavery. And they just kept moving in. And so it kind of backfired here in that they wanted people to settle the area for Mexico, and it ended up, they ended up settling the area for America. By 1830s, these Anglos, or U.S., they outnumbered the local Tejanos, Mexicans. And this resulted in a quick war, 6 months, between the Texas settlers and the Mexican army. In the end, Texas gained independence, became the Republic of Texas in 1836. Only 2 years later, largely because they were in debt, Texas invited the U.S. to annex them. They said, hey, we are very much Americans. We want to be the newest state. And the South says, great, we can add a new slave state. We're going to be more powerful. Great. And North says, yeah, why are we adding more slave states? They oppose this. And what if we go to war with Mexico? Are we ready to go to war with Mexico to fight to expand slavery. So the North was very much against this as an expansion of slavery and a possible path to war. But in the end, more deals were made, and Texas becomes a state in 1845. And this whole era leads to the idea of manifest destiny. And it's pushed in the 1840s and 50s through newspapers and becomes part of public opinion that this is a natural path, that Americans are just going to keep moving west and settle the entire country coast to coast. And there's a religious element too, isn't that they believe that God had manifestly destined the American people to spread their democratic institutions over the entire continent. And so kind of this painting shows this spread west, 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 pushing, taking over nature, taking over Native American tribes, taking over anybody in their way. Southern Democrats support this idea so that they can see slavery expand coast to coast, and possibly even beyond that to take over more Latin American nations. And so this just becomes part of American ideology to keep moving west, to keep expanding, to keep taking. Leading to another war, the war that the Northerners feared, comes. President Polk wanted to buy California from Mexico because it had good land and a lot of ports, and so it could easily open up trade. And ultimately, it's the idea that we want to be coast to coast. So we offer a whole bunch of money to Mexico to buy the land. Mexico was in a little bit of chaos, and so they just refuse. They say, nope, we're not talking about that. Hey, we're not going to sell you California. So Polk basically starts a war with Mexico to take California. He orders 4,000 men under one of his generals, Zachary Taylor, to the Rio Grande border. And so the border was kind of in dispute. We weren't exactly sure where Mexico started and where the United States started. It was still in dispute. And so Polk kind of starts a war saying, okay, we're going to figure out exactly where the border is. So he moves his army right to the border. Mexico says, hey, you're in Mexican land. The Americans say, no, we're in American land. Shots are fired, a few people die, war starts. The U.S. has many victories. Mexico is in a bit of chaos, so they don't really win much of anything in this war. They are just destroyed in this war. The United States wins just about every battle. Not every battle, there's a few minor ones that Mexico wins, but largely, Mexico is destroyed. At the end of this war, just about every major city is taken by America. So now what do we do with all this land? In that we just beat up Mexico, so should we take all of this land? And this starts a debate back in Congress. Northerners say, no, we don't need to take all of this land. Pause. We don't want to take all this land. And so they even attempt to pass an amendment, the Wilmot Proviso, an amendment stating that the territory from Mexico should remain slave-free. And the South says, nope, we're going to keep expanding slavery. But even the South was a little bit nervous about taking all of Mexico because large parts of Mexico was anti-slavery. And they're worried about an insurgency. They're worried about, the Mexicans might continue to fight against these kind of American invaders if the Americans decide to bring in slavery. And so they leave the more populated areas of Mexico, what is Mexico today, they leave to Mexico, but it's the areas where most Mexicans were not living, kind of this northern area, that's what the Americans take. And they do that with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. So the less populated areas in northern Mexico are taken. This expands slavery into all these areas. But it also avoids future fights with the local Mexican population. Yes, some Mexicans were living in this area, but not very many. They set the Texas border officially at the Rio Grande River to avoid any future fights. And after we take all this stuff, we end up paying for it anyways as kind of an apology. Sorry we took your stuff. Hey, here's $15 million. Again, we are now 1/3 bigger. And a little while later, we realize if we want to get a good railroad from Texas to California, there are way too many mountains in this area. And it's way too expensive to blow up all these mountains. So we need to buy some flat land. And so a couple years later, for $10 million, we buy what is southern Arizona, the Gadsden Purchase. So we buy all this land so that we can build a railroad across. and that sets kind of the final border for us. Now, with all this new land, we get a new political party, the Free Soilers, and these are Northerners who oppose slavery in the territory, saying all this new land, we don't want to see slavery expand, no more. Now, it's for different reasons than you might think, in that they didn't trust the other political parties, so they decided, I'm going to make my own political party. They didn't trust the Whigs, which is now a dead party. They didn't trust the Democrats, which is really a party that was built on slavery in many ways. And so their objections to slavery were based on economics, not a moral objection to slavery. They didn't care as far as how slavery was evil, in that they believed that slavery drove down wages for white workers. Why pay for a poor white worker when you can buy a slave? And the idea was if there's less slavery, people are more willing to pay their workers, and they're more willing to pay their workers more. And so they don't want to see any expansion of slavery here. Okay. Meanwhile, now that we got California, people start to settle in. 1848, we find, oh, there's gold there. There's a lot of gold there. And so we've been looking for gold in the United States for a few hundred years. We finally figured out, oh, it's in the mountains on the other side of the country. And so everybody rushes in. It takes a year to get there because there weren't any really roads or trains yet. Or not trains, but railroad tracks yet. So it takes a year to get there, and so people show up in 1849, hence 49ers. So many people rush in at once that the government of California can't handle all these people at once because the government barely existed. And so just everybody rushes in. There's no law, there's no police. There's just kind of a small military government. Because usually it takes a few decades to fill up a state so that to fill up a territory so that it becomes a state. California does it in 1 year because all of a sudden there's gold, everybody moves in at once. And so they kind of skip the territorial stage and go straight to statehood. And so in 1849, they apply to Congress to become a state. And Southerners object to California's admission as a free state because, hey, we drew a line saying, okay, this is the North, this is the South. And California kind of goes right through that line, says, nope, we're just going to be a free state. And all the people that moved into California, these were not plantation owners. A lot of these were poor people that were hoping to find gold. The fear was, if slavery was added to California, what if just a plantation owner shows up with 300 slaves and takes all the gold? And so a lot of these small-time miners reject slavery for that reason. The fear that, what if one guy with 300 slaves shows up and kind of takes over an entire mountain and takes all the gold? And so they don't want slavery in California because of that. But the South was a little annoyed that we're breaking the 1820 Compromise, and that this kind of splits North and South. So we make another deal, Compromise of 1850. Southerners, again, they're threatening to leave secession if they add California. So again, this should have been the line. So that California would have been Northern and Southern California. Southern California would have had slavery, Northern California would not. But the Californians didn't want slavery at all. So here's the deal. Henry Clay, again, this kind of great compromiser, comes up with a deal. Here's what the North gets. They get California as a free state. So this whole line of North and South, it's very messy now. Here's what the South gets. A more effective fugitive slave law. And I'll talk about that in a second. Both sides, the deal is any future states, the people in those states get to decide for themselves. Okay. And going back to that, and that kind of takes the pressure off of Congress, and that Congress doesn't have to fight over slavery, just let the people fight it out. As far as fugitive slave law, it was already in the Constitution. If your slave runs away, you're allowed to go get him. But this really strengthens it and gives it some teeth. And so federal slave catchers, federal commissioners, are going to be paid more to return slaves than to free them. And so slave catchers can now cross state lines, and they can go hunt down slaves in free states. And this is really what strengthens the Underground Railroad, because all of a sudden, any Northerner caught helping a slave escape would be jailed for 6 months and fined $1,000 in that time's money. And so Northerners are pretty angry about this, because all of a sudden, the South is allowed to come in and kind of invade their territory and try to really take over. as far as, again, seizing their property. And so Northerners are pretty upset by the harshness of this law, and in many cases, they just say, fine, I'm going to do what I want, I'm going to ignore federal law, and so this, again, it's states versus federal issue here. And so it's a lot of Northerners are saying, I reject federal law and I'm going to do what I want. We want more land. We even start to think about taking Cuba, because Cuba was prized by Southerners who saw it as a possible new slave state to restore the balance in the Senate. And Cuba became a really profitable sugar colony. They became one of the biggest producers of sugar because when Haiti died, which is Haiti is right next door, there's Haiti, this became the new sugar colony when Haiti fell. And Spain had already lost most of their colonies, so it's kind of an easy target. And so the president even started to come up with ideas as far as how to take Cuba. First, we offered Spain a whole bunch of money to buy it. Spain said, nope, we're making way too much money off of Cuba, we don't want to sell it. And so he even comes up with the Ostend Manifesto, this little plan of his, saying if Spain doesn't allow us to buy if Spain didn't allow America to buy Cuba for $120 million, we're just going to take it. And somebody leaked this document, and it made the president look really bad, saying, we're just starting wars to expand slavery. And so Northerners attack him, and he looks really bad. He's not going to get a second term, not that he wanted one anyways. And so it kind of shows the Southerners want to continue to expand, even to take over Latin America. We'll stop there.